Let me introduce you to Christine Grandy, who's going to be talking about MACE, a project that's based here at the university. A really interesting project, indeed it is.
Great. Thank you. Great. Thanks for coming, you guys. I feel like this is my first time with a microphone, so this is what all historians dream of. So I'm going to talk today about some teaching and research-based teaching that I've been doing with the MACE archive, which is a media archive for Central England, which is based at Lincoln. It moved here in 2011 from Leicester, I believe. And it's an independent accredited archive on campus that we're really lucky to make use of. So this is about how history students at the undergraduate and now the graduate level are using MACE within their modules. So a little bit about MACE. It's an independent archive on campus, so it is housed at Lincoln, but it's not actually embedded in Lincoln. And I think the independence of the archive is something to sort of something that I had to really keep in mind as I approached the archive and started talking to them about using the material there within modules at Lincoln. And they luckily are a lovely bunch of people and really happy to collaborate. So that was fairly easy, but it did pose some challenges for making material accessible to the students, which I'll talk about in a minute. So MACE holds over 75,000 pieces of material, and that is growing all the time. They literally have people bringing skip loads of film to them every week, and so the holdings are growing. The type of material they house is very diverse. It's not just sort of film as we think of film, but rather documentary films about World War II. There's some really great stuff about the miners' strike and documentaries created by the National Union of Miners in the 80s through the Miners Tape Project. There's some fantastic and sometimes terrible promotional films, largely relating to Skegness for some reason. But this is sort of the age of advertising in the sort of the early 60s, things like easy clean ovens and stuff like that. There's also quite a lot of amateur film, which is something that I work with on my own research. So amateur films are home movies, and within MACE right now, there are 2,100 home movies from the 1920s right up until really the 2010s at this point. So the home movies themselves are very poorly shot. They're sort of, you know, they're kind of like what home movies are, like really terrible and dull and boring. But they're an immensely important source for understanding the everyday of the past. But I think probably the strongest collection within MACE is their ITV regional reporting. So ITV, when it sort of emerged in 1955, and they looked around for people to become the Midlands broadcaster, ABC took up that contract and became ATV, so ITV's Midlands reporting. So MACE has all of this. It's a great material. It has sound associated with it, and it's a fantastic resource for looking at 20th century British history, which is what I am a specialist in and what I teach on. So within the ITV material itself, there's also just sort of a range of different types of media, like vox pops, interviews on the streets with sort of random people and sometimes quite curated interviews on the streets, reporting within the field, and then a lot more sort of studio-based broadcasting. And certainly the 1980s are amazing to look at with all the lasers and the hair and the fantastic sort of studio environment of the 1980s. Right, so for historians and for a 20th century historian and historian of media, and I moved from Canada to the UK sort of the year before I came to Lincoln, and these media archives are sort of, there's 8 of them within the UK, and some of them are quite well developed, like the Yorkshire Film Archive. MACE is probably the strongest out of them. Some of them have really sort of like low-tech websites, low-tech catalogs. But for someone from Canada, from North America, you know, these kind of things just don't exist over there. So I was really excited to sort of get my hands on this, and I saw a lot of sort of teaching opportunities associated with it. Because basically every possible topic you could be interested in 20th century British history can be met by the holdings of the archive itself. It's a very sort of broad range of material on tap. So teaching with MACE seemed immediately appealing to me. There's the accessibility of an archive on campus for students, and students are usually quite hesitant to go into archive spaces. The archives are very intimidating to them, but we could hopefully sort of break down those sort of barriers with having it so close by. And also that students themselves could be historians in the making, right? And this is sort of something we emphasize throughout our degree program, that they will become historians by the end of their time at Lincoln. And they're working with sources that a lot of people haven't looked at and haven't made use of at all. But there were challenges, right? I think there might have been a picture there, but their challenges were basically trying to get what's in the archive out to the students in an accessible way, right? So the archive itself, if any of you have seen it, it's in the MHT building, on the main floor of the MHT building. It's a very swish, very cool sort of, you know, film archive environment, but it's pretty small, and they have a viewing room that only holds about 6 people at a time, if that. So like every archive, they kind of struggle to kind of make space for that viewing material or those viewing needs. So having, you know, a whole sort of, you know, seminars of students going through the archive was just not realistic in terms of going into the viewing room. So it was about trying to get that material that the archive has out to the students and what was sort of the best way to do that. There was also the needs of the independent archive, which basically has agreements about how the material is going to be used, right? So when people deposit their home movies, they sign agreements saying, well, this will be used for this end, right? So they need some sort of discretion around the material being used appropriately. So really it was about trying to find an appropriate platform to get all of this film, which also poses a problem because they're huge files. Blackboard couldn't handle it. So how to get this material to the students themselves. Alongside of that was also, there's so much material in MACE, 75,000 pieces. What do we bring to the students? And this is the problem with digital humanities and sort of primary sources online for historians right now. There's so much material that it's really overwhelming for students, and they don't know how to sort of access it, and then they just sort of drop out of it, right? It's overwhelming for researchers at this point, but for students it's also a problem. So the solution was, well, first off, to get them familiar with MACE's Central website, which has actually just been relaunched over the summer, and is a great sort of database itself and has quite a lot of online material on it. So if you type in a search word, I put an immigrant up here, you can see there's 151 results that came from it. You can click and just sort of have the video ones. There's 30 there. But the archive itself has much more digitized than what is actually online. So it's about sort of getting that non-online digitized stuff out to the kids. And then you can see there's different forms that the material itself can take. The solution, though, sort of moving beyond the archives website itself and what was online, they only have about 7% of their material online right now, was to come up with something that, a platform that the students could access but satisfied the needs of the archive for discretion. So we came up with this Vimeo platform. So we bought a Vimeo site and we renew it every year. And it was something that the archive was already using. They had their own Vimeo channel, but we just made a sort of discrete Vimeo channel that is password protected. So all the students in history and heritage have a password, or they all have access to this, and it's a really basic, like it's like teaching with MACE at lincoln.ac, and then password teaching with MACE. And none of it's really secret, and all the students can sort of have access to it. So there's more material on this, but also I was able to go to the archivists at MACE, and a very lovely archivist named Phil, and just tell him what we needed to do, what we wanted to do, and did he have any ideas of material that could sort of populate this Vimeo site. So what we were able to do is organize the material by albums, which you can do on Vimeo. And Vimeo still has some problems, and I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. But you can organize the material by albums, which was a nice way of sort of bringing down that scale problem, right? A nice way of making it sort of accessible. We organized it by material where we knew there was appropriate secondary sources that the students could ask or could access about it. So if we get a sense of, right now there's 309 videos on the Vimeo site. I think it takes something like 70 hours of viewing. There are 31 albums and growing on a bunch of different topics. And these are sort of jointly curated by myself and the archivists at MACE. So the topics include, well, basically anything I can think of. And then sometimes Phil coming up with ideas as well. So the most recent albums we made are about AIDS and sex education in the 1980s, the National Front, immigrant housing, Princess Diana, which I thought would be really popular with the students and is really not. Enoch Powell's very popular. UFOs, strangely popular. Quite a lot of regional reporting about UFOs in the 60s, but also a great entrance to talking about class and media in the period. So there's a ton of different options for the students. They can build their essays around this. They can build their secondary reading and further primary reading, primary source material research around it. So in that way, it has been like this really nice collaboration with the archive that satisfies their needs and satisfies ours. The last sort of element of this is really trying to sort of tap into this the student as producer thing, which is something we sort of always do with students in history anywhere. Make their research sort of visible, right? They do this huge amount of work. They create these independent studies at the end of their third year, but they're doing fantastic primary research archive work on MACE itself. So what we did was we just really sort of slapped together a not particularly sophisticated WordPress site that is also called Teaching with MACE. So at this point we have 3 sites. We have the MACE archive itself, that website, the Vimeo site, and this WordPress site. And in this environment, they upload their assessments. And this is a third-year module that we have them doing this in. And you can see that it's all sort of built about their film analysis, the research project, and then we have a blog where we talk about kind of what's been happening in the classroom. So you get things like this. Georgina did a great essay about Margaret Thatcher's use of the media in the 1980s. And the archive agreed to have all the material that they used within their essays themselves, allowed them to be unpassword protected so that employers could visit or parents could visit and see the material that they themselves were writing about. So that has been really great. The students can create tags for them, and the creation of the tags thinks about them sort of organizing the material themselves into their own kind of archive in lots of ways. Right, so the outcomes of this and the sort of conclusions of this has been this really nice combination of research, archival and teaching interests via sort of pretty basic and accessible digital platforms. We've embedded MACE within the History BA at the second year. We realized that we needed a bit more time to get them used to the archive, to sort of think about the archive as a space itself and talk about sort of challenges around the digital. So we started embedding this at the second year. We have it in the third year, and now we're bumping it up to the fourth year, or not the fourth year, the MA, because it is some really great research for an MA project, an MA dissertation itself. So having it embedded has been made it a lot easier for the students to step into it. It kind of ticks some boxes on student employability and I've had students sort of send these to employers, but also in their applications for graduate school and further learning in their lives. I think the next step for us is really trying to use the Central MACE catalog to talk about quantitative analysis. How can you use the database itself as a site and put new sort of information within your essays? Because historians and history students are usually taking a history degree to avoid things like quantitative analysis. But we're going to try and sort of step that back a bit and sort of walk them through the use of the potentials of sort of database analysis using MACE itself and having that featured on the website. And I think beyond this, it also gives them a really strong understanding of archives as spaces, the sort of contribution of archives themselves, and how something like a media archive can tell us about sort of the mediatization of the everyday life in the 20th century. Okay, that's it. Thank you.